Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this, our first briefing room for 2025. My name is Luke Brown, I'm Head of International Programs and Engagement here at Climateworks Centre, and I'll be your host today as we dive into the trends shaping climate action in 2025 across Australia and Southeast Asia. But first, let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands which each of us are dialing in from today. For my part, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. I also want to extend my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders joining us today, and please do feel free to use the chat function to tell us which country you're dialing in from today. I'm really excited about our program. Today, I'll be joined by my colleagues Anna Malos and Chung Nguyen, two regional climate policy and investment experts at the Climateworks Centre, who will help explain how our work here fits into the bigger context of climate action and influence in Australia and Southeast Asia. It's my great pleasure to introduce them. Firstly, Anna is Climateworks Australia Country Lead. Her team enhances Climateworks' understanding of the Australian political and economic landscape. And Anna focuses on influencing policy and investment, engaging with external stakeholders, and helping teams across Climateworks make the most of opportunities to create and embed systems change towards a net zero future. Chung leads our Southeast Asia team. Her role is focused on contributing to Climateworks strategy and engagement in our region, and her team works with stakeholders in Australia and throughout the Southeast Asia region on programs on climate finance, the transition to a low carbon economy, and the energy transition more broadly. Over the next hour, Anna, Chung, and I will take you through some of the global trends affecting climate action in three major sectors of our economy: industry, energy, and finance. We'll be taking your questions at the end of the presentation, but please feel free to submit your questions at any time using the Q&A button on your screen. So we're going to kick off today by looking at the latest in Australia and Southeast Asia's energy sector. This is the most important place to start, given that energy is our region's and the world's largest emitting single sector. It's also the place where research from Climateworks and others shows that the quickest wins can be had as we shift generation to renewables and drive efficiency. This means energy is the sector that will enable others to reach net zero, provided that the transition to renewables can happen at the pace and scale that our modelling shows is needed. I'll pass you first over to Chung to take us through what she's seeing as the big influences on Southeast Asia's energy transition in 2025. Over to you, Chung.
Thank you, Luke. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, depending on where you're dialing to today. So on the energy in Southeast Asia, I think the first thing I would like to highlight is the growing renewable energy adoption, which is really positive. According to the IEA, Southeast Asia renewable capacity is expected to reach around 200 gigawatt by 2030, and solar and wind will account for 60% of the plant installation. So a key challenge for the energy transition in South Asia is the need to phase out both on-grid and off-grid coal-fired power plants in South Asia, which are relatively young. And at the same time, it's very important to upgrade the interconnection and improve the storage infrastructures as well. The second trend is around South Asia can be a really potential for a global green energy corridor. South Asia countries have a really strong opportunity to enhance regional grid connectivity, and a more integrated grid would facilitate cross-border energy trade, improve energy security, and also reduce storage and transmission costs. Singapore already positioned itself as a major importer of renewable electricity. It's very important to meet their 2050 net zero targets. At the moment, most of the cross-border electricity comes from Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand. But with ASEAN and Singapore's leadership, more projects are in the pipelines, including plans to even connect with Australia and India as well. And this positions South Asia as a global clean energy hub. Last but not least, I think it's very important to talk about the financing for energy transition, which is crucial for South Asia. At the moment, South Asia is still investing in more fossil fuels than in clean energy, unfortunately. So for every dollar spent on clean energy, um, for every dollar spent on fossil fuel in South Asia, only 80 cents goes to clean energy. Whereas for the global trend, this ratio it's close to 1 to 2, which is in favor of clean energy. So in order to close this gap, there are several policy actions needed. I think the first thing is really about strengthening investor confidence through long-term policy certainties, expanding financing options for the region to attract private finance investment in renewables. And the last but not least is really to enhance the scale-up development finance, which is very important to reduce the investment risks and unlock more capital in the region. Maybe I'm going to pass it on to Anna to bring us to Australia context.
Thanks, Trang. And so in Australia, some of the dynamics are fairly similar with our Southeast Asian region, and some are quite distinct because obviously we're a much more developed country. Now, one of the things that is key is that coal-fired power stations are reaching the end of their life, and that's one of the key parts of the basics of the electricity system that's really changing. This fact that they're aging is causing relatively high levels of breakdowns, which sits alongside scheduled shutdowns for maintenance. And that means you get very tight electricity supply and higher prices during those periods of instability. And this need to replace aging power plants is also combining with the imperative to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and get that shift to zero emissions electricity. Governments and private companies who own Australia's electricity assets, that's the power plants, the poles and the wires that provide us with electricity, they're all investing in renewable energy. Investment levels at the moment are very high. And same as, in Southeast Asia and the rest of the world, renewables are the cheapest source of new generation. This high level of investment is creating a virtuous circle. This shift to renewable generation worldwide means that you've got falling costs. Renewable technologies have dramatically reduced in price across the board. So whether that's solar, large or small, wind, and now storage. Now, Australia took 10 years to get from 10% to 20% share of renewables in the East Coast system. Same change is now taking 2 to 3 years, and it's getting faster. By the end of the year, we're expecting to have the majority of electricity supplied by renewable energy. And that really is changing the game. It changes how we can all reduce emissions across the whole economy. Now, the other side, though, is that there are fundamental changes happening in the gas market. There is this awareness that gas is a fuel in transition. In other words, yes, it's needed now, but in the future, it won't be. And that's because gas still creates emissions, both when you burn it and when you extract and transport it. To reach Australian and global emissions targets in a cost-effective way, a phase out of gas use in most sectors is essential. There are some others. Now, the other thing that's happening is existing gas basins, where we get our gas from in Australia, are nearly depleted. And new basins, especially those in some parts of the country, they're more expensive and they're more polluting to extract and transport the gas. So the energy story is not just about electricity, it's also about gas use. Electrification is gaining traction. In many cases, it's more energy efficient and it will be cheaper. In other cases where electricity isn't yet the ideal source to switch to, other sources may be needed. That could be hydrogen or biofuels. Now, the switch from gas is already increasing in homes. We're starting to see the impact in the gas system. But industrial users are expected to follow likewise, particularly for low temperature heat. So that's things like food processing. And this will profoundly affect how much gas is used where. So what are we focusing on? We're looking for ways to ensure that Australia has clean, affordable and reliable electricity. Now, Australia's in the midst of discussions about what is next for the electricity system and the market. So we're keeping our focus on what energy users need and where, so we can advise governments, investors, businesses on how to unlock Australia's economic opportunities and to power our homes affordably. In many ways, that bigger challenge is around gas because it's still an emerging issue. Australia's at the cusp of having to deal with that issue and about who pays for gas transmission and distribution, given that those systems will be used by fewer customers. Climateworks has discussed the overall and economic and environmental importance of phasing out gas use since we started. We're now working to show governments and others how to implement changes to make sure change is orderly and effective, and to understand what it means for both the electricity and the gas markets. So now I think it's back to Luke.
Thanks so much, Anna. Thank you, Chung. It's really encouraging, I think, to hear that momentum is sort of growing, but yeah, certainly the transition is not linear in the energy sector, and there's some really big policy and financial hurdles across both regional economies. Before we do move on to our next sector, though, we did get a lot of questions on this area, and I wanted to share one of those questions with you first, Chung, if I can. We know how important it is to engage with communities on renewable energy projects. We're certainly seeing that in Australia as well as throughout the region, not just to secure social license for those projects, but also to drive their long-term success through better project design and benefit sharing. With that in mind, we have a question around how should regional and remote communities be engaged to promote a successful transition to renewable energy? I'm really interested in your thoughts on this, Chung. I know your team's done a lot of work in this area.
Thank you, Luke. And thanks those who asked this question, because it's very important for South Asia context. At the moment, 7 out of 11 countries in South Asia still have GDP per capita less than $5,000 per year. So it's very important that as we accelerate the transition, we need to bring the people in the rural, regional, and remote communities along the ride. As Luke mentioned, we have done some research on this. A report called The Building Block on Just Energy Transition Partnership in Indonesia and Vietnam provides some of the several recommendations that across 4 benchmarks: systemic, finance, socioeconomics, and governance. We plan to launch a new report soon, and which includes some of the recommendations for these. For example, we recommend that there should be a roadmap for reskilling and upskilling the co-workers in the remote areas. We should prioritize the opportunities for marginalized community. We got recommendations about a very comprehensive compensation framework and the social safety net programs. We also think that it's very important to have, for governments to think about some of the targeted economic diversification initiatives to create jobs in sustainable industries in the rural communities and regions. And I think last but not least, very unique to South Asia as well, that I think there needs to be more closer fostering partnership between industry, local government, and education institutions in order to align the reskilling efforts with the renewable sector demands, because there's so much need to be done in the future, and the government alone cannot do this. So it needs a very strong collaboration partnership with the government and industries. I'm gonna post that over back to you.
Thanks, Chung. It's a really interesting area, and for those interested, I do encourage you to check out both the forthcoming paper, but also a paper we published a year or 2 ago, led by our colleague, Dr. Jared A.S., who's an expert in this area, along with the rest of the team in the Southeast Asia area. We will move on now to our next sector, which is industry. Climateworks has got a long history of working on decarbonising heavy industry in Australia and the region. And by industry, we mean those heavy consumers, usually hard to abate areas of the economy that make things like aluminum, steel, the manufacturing industry, textiles in Southeast Asia, etc. These sectors generally face a somewhat larger decarbonisation challenge owing to the technologies that are at play in the manufacturing of the goods they make. But we know that there's also significant opportunities, both existing and emerging, for industrial decarbonisation, specifically in our region. A large body of research by Climateworks and others demonstrates how Australia's industrial precincts can transition from exporters of fossil fuels to being exporters of goods with embedded sunshine. And greening the rapidly growing supply chains of the ASEAN region presents really a once-in-a-generation opportunity for industrial transformation that's happening right now on our doorstep, with some engagement from Australia and other firms. So I'll pass back to you, Chung, to shed some light on developments in industrial decarbonisation and share some of the challenges and opportunities in this sector.
Thank you, Luke. First of all, I really just want to highlight that under the current policy, Southeast Asia is expected to account for 25% of the global energy demand growth by 2035. And this largely driven by expanding manufacturing sector. So basically, the world cannot decarbonize without addressing industrial emissions in this region. So at the moment, a lot of governments in South Asia are considering allocating public investment for future growth through initiative. For example, the Indonesian government just announced the establishment of its sovereign wealth fund, Dana Tara. So I think this public investment is really important to channel this funding to the sustainable infrastructure initiative, rather than locking in high carbon energy system and infrastructures. The ASEAN strategy for carbon neutrality provides a really good framework to recognize and to align climate and economic goals, but there are a lot of actions needed from government and industries to actually help Southeast Asia to achieve these dual goals. And Luke, you mentioned the Net Zero Industrial Precincts initiative. For those who are more familiar with the other concept, for example, Clean Energy Hub or Low Carbon Industry Hub. So this is an initiative by Climateworks Centre, you can see on the link, that accelerate industrial decarbonization through consolidating operation within industrial cluster, hubs and precincts. And by doing so, companies can benefit from shared infrastructure, integrated renewable energy system, and stronger supply chain collaboration. So for Indonesia, we look at around 31,000 standalone facility and 139 industrial estates across the country. Through our research and analysis, we identify 5 key precincts that can serve as the model for low carbon industrial development. And this work led by our colleagues in Indonesia and our industry team. In Vietnam, we are assessing 17 existing industrial zones to identify the best opportunities for scaling up clean energy solutions and decarbonizing industrial operations. So this is and through demonstrating what successful net zero industrial hub would look like, we really hope that this could provide a framework for Southeast Asia countries to transition to low carbon economy. And the last thing I really want to highlight is the very potential for Southeast Asia to become a global clean technology manufacturing leader. Southeast Asia has all the key ingredients needed to become a global hub for clean energy manufacturing. Very strong critical mineral reserve, strong renewable energy potential, very established manufacturing expertise, because already the region is the global manufacturing hub and a skilled labor force. So already Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand are among the world top solar PV manufacturers and exporters. Indonesia is very well known for a major player in the global electric vehicles and battery storage supply chain. So very, very strong opportunity for the region to become the clean energy, to accelerate the clean energy transition, while at the same time driving the industries and the economic growth and job creation for the region. I'm gonna stop there and hand over to Anna.
Thank you. So, you know, again, there's a bit of a kind of pairing between, or there can be, between Australia and the region. The Australian economy has long been dominated by primary production, so exports of mineral resources, mostly as ore, and fossil fuels such as coal and gas more recently, as well as agricultural products. But there's now growing interest in what resources Australia has to offer that's fit for a net zero world, particularly critical minerals like lithium and rare earth metals, some of these things that Trung was already talking about for Southeast Asia. The other thing that Australia has is great renewable energy resources and the space to exploit them, to make the most of them. Now, governments would like to diversify and strengthen the Australian economy, particularly by more processing of these resources and getting what's known as value add from the resources we've got already and getting more production. And that's a desire from all governments, from industry, from investors, and it's about making the most of Australia's competitive advantages. That's, you know, that's quite often known as onshoring, so where you get more of the production happening within a country rather than just exploiting and exporting raw materials. Now, obviously, we're in an increasingly dynamic trade environment. That's partly because we're undergoing this big transition from being very dependent on fossil fuels to potentially getting, you know, really understanding the opportunities, the benefits from a net zero world. And regional cooperation is going to be key in this area. Australia has got great resources for that future world. We've got skills, we've got a stable economic system and governance that investors find attractive. And we're highly connected to Southeast Asia. So, you know, if Southeast Asia really does become, like it's got the opportunity, become that green manufacturing centre, then Australia is one of the places that can supply it with the right materials. And so Australia can remain an export nation if it responds to those trade dynamics and if it really understands how important regional cooperation is. Climateworks helps government and the private sector understand what that looks like. We, you know, in Australia, that's partly about understanding the role that different actors can play to support new markets, to coordinate energy and other infrastructure, as well as thinking about our trade agreements. And Climateworks really does help make the most of those economic opportunities. As Trung mentioned, we're focusing on key regions. In Australia, one area of focus is Gladstone. We recently released a report about the future energy demand for Gladstone and how that can unlock greater production and greater kind of economic opportunities from the resources we've got already. And I'll send us back to Luke now, because I could talk about this all day, but really it is about Australia has particular advantages, Southeast Asia has the other. How can these regions act together and really kind of make the most of the transition that's coming?
Thanks, Anna. And I can assure you the Climateworks kitchen is constantly full of these sorts of conversations. We can talk about this all day, but we won't. We will keep moving. Anna, your point about trade dynamics really resonated with me as a recovering trade negotiator and is probably also front of mind for a lot of our audience, given developments in the US with tariffs on products globally, including Australia's steel and aluminum. Do you have thoughts on what these tariffs might mean for broader economic development in Australia and the region, and particularly what they might mean for the progress to net zero?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth understanding that, you know, there has been this new kind of kick up in tariffs, and it's definitely a new phase. But it's a phase that has been happening for some time. You know, there was a big push towards globalization, lots of free trade agreements, but now there's starting to be some countries, you know, being increasingly cautious, wanting to protect their own economy. Now, I don't think that's the kind of putting in tariffs, I don't think is a sensible option. It really just kind of penalizes production equally, doesn't think about what changes you really want to create. It's far better. If you want greater domestic production, there are more constructive ways you can do that. Now, if tariffs sort of from a country with an economy the size and trade relationships the size of the US, there's no question that tariffs is going to have an impact on the rest of the global economy. It's likely, and especially because of the uncertainty, you're likely to get a bit of a kind of, a pause. People will start to be a bit uncertain about what to invest in and where, and that's never good for economic development. However, so far, you've pretty much just got the relationships between the US and then reciprocal reaction to it. Where it will start to be much more important for the global economy is if you get a kind of broader response where lots of countries start to go, well, if they're going to do it, I'm going to do it. And that's where things could start to get even less certain and messier. However, we still know that there's inevitable change that's needed in order to avoid climate impacts. Those changes will keep happening. The rate at which they change might be different. And there might be some instances where these kinds of tariffs actually kind of mean that some countries kind of look ahead to the future and kind of try and leap ahead. If they're going to be affected by tariffs anyway, what else can they do to really get, more money from the resources they've got and a sort of cleaner future as well?
Thanks, Anna. I will resist the urge to take this into a long conversation about the shifting of incentives and shadow prices and CBAM and the IRA and the role of industry policy and tariffs in the more recent developments. But yeah, absolutely. I think something that is going to be really critical in particularly this industry sector, but also more broadly in the transition. If you've just joined us, welcome to the Climateworks Centre first briefing room of the year. I'm Luke Brown, and our two speakers today are Anna Malos and Chung Nguyen. So far, we've broken down the trends moving industry and energy towards net zero and in Australia and Southeast Asia. And I can see a lot of questions streaming into the chat. So I'll make sure we cover our third sector in good time to get on to a discussion with our panelists. We all know industrial transition doesn't happen in isolation, and that the role of finance through firm investments and corporate action more broadly will be critical in driving this and other sectors of our economy to net zero. Climateworks has been working closely with leading corporate entities in Australia and the region to understand their transition and to support their credible journey towards net zero. We're now going to move to our final sector to talk about what's affecting the corporate sector's transition to low carbon operations, both in Australia and throughout our region. And I will pass it back to you to lead us off, Chung.
Thank you, Luke. So for corporations in Southeast Asia, the first thing I want to highlight is really want to share our recently launched report done by our colleagues in Indonesia, Pecha Christie and colleagues, called the Decarbonizing Industry, Indonesia's Manufacturing Sector. And you can see the link to the report in the chat box. The report highlights how there are a lot of readily available solutions that can significantly reduce emissions across key industries. And for Indonesia, it's food and beverage, textile, and chemicals. These industries together account for manufacturing industry together account for a quarter of Indonesia total emissions. The finding of the report highlight that the most immediate and cost-effective pathway include a solution like enhancing energy efficiency, which is quite low-hanging fruit solutions. These technology require some of the upfront investment, but they deliver long-term financial benefits by lowering energy costs and reducing reliance on fossil fuels. And in the report, we analyze what is the context in Indonesia looks like and how those technology can be applied to those contexts. And the second thing I really want to highlight, which is very unique to South Asia, is that the region is home to 70 million micro, small, medium enterprises. We call it MSMEs, and many of which are very integrated into the global supply chain, and they play an extremely crucial role in the economic and social development of the region. These small companies often have quite limited financial resources, but research shows that they tend to be more agile in adopting new technologies. So in order to unlock this full potential and to help these company transition, it requires a long-term strategy and to equip the small medium enterprises and the workforce with the skills and support needed to thrive in the rapidly evolving economy. So as we think about accelerating the transition in the region, it's important to bring these small and medium enterprises along the ride. I'm going to post that and hand over to Anna.
Thank you. So within Australia, there's a slightly different dynamic in a way. Now, corporations, businesses are still seeing the benefits of acting on climate. You know, many of them, or particularly the ones that are energy and emissions intensive, they're already under pressure from customers and investors to reduce their emissions and address their kind of climate risks. And those climate risks are both about the physical impact. So, you know, Australia knows only too well the kinds of climate impacts that will become more and more common. We've had, you know, lots of extreme weather that is worsening under climate change. But the other side of climate risks is if you as a company don't address the fact that you're a high emitter, then, you know, customers will look elsewhere for products that are greener, that, you know, perhaps that company has already switched to renewable energy, or they're using different processes. Now, some companies are really keen to take the lead in those areas. They recognize the opportunities that are available and are actively seeking investment to help realize them. In Australia, there's also policy that's already driving action by businesses and by investors. Now, some of that's around, you know, disclosure of emissions, known as mandatory climate-related financial disclosures. Now, there's already been voluntary commitments in this area, and international financiers have been looking at making sure that they understand what risks companies are exposed to and which are greener companies, where can they send their money that is creating transition rather than kind of locking in the old way of doing things. All major businesses now in Australia have to show how they're addressing climate risk, and they have to declare those emissions. And this helps everyone, customers, shareholders, investors, understand and address action. And as I said, financiers are really factoring in climate risk. What that means is if you're a high emissions company that's not doing something about your emissions, you're likely to be charged more for your financing than a company that's really starting to transition. Climateworks is helping governments understand what else can help, how to implement the corporate regulation that Australia's got already, and supporting businesses meet those, you know, new requirements. Say, for instance, how to plan for and report on emissions reductions. Now, it is a real, you know, it's a mixed package. Not all companies are taking action, but many are. And as I said, many are really keen to take a lead. Back to you, Luke.
Thanks so much, Anna, and thank you, Chung. Before I throw the floor open for questions, and thank you again for everybody that is furiously submitting through the Q&A button on your screen. I'm seeing a sort of theme emerging in the questions around the recent withdrawal of some financial institutions from the Global Banking Alliance and other clubs, if you like, for sustainable finance. And I think the key theme in the questions and something that we might want to expand on before we switch is just whether this global scale back, whether this reflects a global retreat from ambition on climate and sustainability. Maybe Chung, if you wanted to give us your thoughts first, and then we can hear from Anna on the Australia picture.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Luke. I think it's important to address that these financial institutions withdraw from the banking alliance, but not withdrawing from their own net zero goals. And also at the same time, these institutions cannot represent the whole global financial institutions. And at the moment, nearly half of the world's privately managed money has pledged to align with the science by net zero goals in the Paris Agreement. And I think that this trend will stay. At the moment, we also have global financial reporting standards that including very thorough requirements on reporting on emissions, which will become very mandatory in various places. And the second thing I really want to highlight is around, at the moment, a lot of reports show that the economic damage from climate change will be very severe globally, but for Southeast Asia, the damage will be twice as much as the global average. So I think investors will have to factor in these into their transition risks, physical risks, and the future scenarios and investment decisions. So these are all the facts that remain unchanged no matter which coalitions that they withdraw or stay. Over to you, Anna.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I'd kind of add to that. So if you look at what's happening in Australia, our big banks are mostly staying in those clubs at the moment. However, you know, some of them have started to move. But one of the things that interests me is if you look, even those, you know, investors or banks that are withdrawing from these clubs, they're not changing what they're saying to their clients. And they're not saying, you know, the kind of advice they're giving. And that's the sort of action speaks louder than words. You know, I think it's unfortunate there has been this pushback against these clubs because they were generating momentum and change. However, that kind of underlying momentum, it's still there. And certainly in Australia, you know, many of it's still there because it's now locked into our legislation. And even if we have a change of government, it's not as, you know, it's not that easy to unpick legislation. So I think there is still real momentum, and there's still some of that momentum is kind of happening in the quiet places rather than in public spaces. I'd like to see it happening in both. But what I really care about is that underlying action. And I think, you know, I can certainly still see many signs that that's still happening.
Yeah, thank you both. I think that's a really important point. At the end of the day, as Cass Williams, our sustainable finance lead, always says, money just hunts returns. And we know the economic and environmental signals are all there that the returns in the future will be renewables, and that this shift will happen. It's just, I think the key is, how do we keep that momentum, and how do we keep that transition happening in a pace required to maintain warming to 1.5 or as near as possible. Thank you both, and thank you everyone again for joining. Before we open to questions from our audience, I want to synthesize another theme which is emerging throughout a lot of the questions, which is just around the Australian federal election. And so I might just pass that straight to you, Anna, on behalf of a few questioners. How do you think the upcoming election in Australia could influence some of the trends we've talked about today?
Well, no question. You know, a federal government always affects the key policy issues of our day, and this is definitely one of them. And there are clear differences between the, you know, the two main parties. However, there's also some real similarities. The net zero by 2050 overall goal, it was put in place by a coalition government. It's still supported by, you know, the potential alternative government. So there's no difference in that key goal. And that really acts as that anchor signal to everything else that needs to happen. Then the question is, how do you meet that goal, and how do you do so cost effectively? And there's also, you know, other areas where both sides of the main parties are still in agreement. So, for instance, you know, the commitment to the Paris Agreement and all the different implications of that being in a Paris Agreement has for a country like Australia. That will be the, you know, that fundamental will be the same no matter which government we get. And the other thing to remember is a lot of the key areas, so particularly in energy, but also in, to a lesser extent, in industry, you know, our state and territory governments are as important as our federal government. And they, you know, our state and territory governments, they all have that net zero goal, Most of them have interim targets, and around energy, they understand what that energy transition means, that it means investing in renewable energy because that's the cheapest way forward. And so many actions will just keep going. I'm not saying that there won't be an impact, but there's always different ways that you can get to the same end.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I think it was Paul Keating that said, you change the Prime Minister, you change the country, but this is a global problem. And so Australia's economic and national security will continue to be a factor of our ability to respond to this challenge, irrespective of the party of the day. Okay, we have a lot of questions to cover, and I will do my best to prioritize and make sure we get to as many of you as possible. The first one I wanted to touch on was around the potential for an Australian-hosted COP. So this would be COP31, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference in 2026. And Anna from Melbourne has asked, where should community groups focus their efforts in preparation for a potential Australia-hosted COP? We know that Australia has undertaken, if successful in the bid, to host in partnership with the Pacific. So I think there's an important area of engagement there. But I'm interested, maybe you, Chung, first, and Anna following, if you have anything to add, just on sort of where you think the community engagement would have the most impact on our successful hosting of that conference.
Thank you, Luke. I think given the current geopolitical trends that we touch on during throughout the session today, I think it's very important that the community will be able to come together and support for stronger global solidarity to keep 1.5 alive, and having that global community endorsement is very important. It either can be through bringing the voice of vulnerable communities being impacted by climate change, showing solidarity with our Pacific neighbors, or coming together and facilitate knowledge sharing on community-led solutions. I think all of that is very important at the moment. Over to you.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Anna, anything to add there?
Yeah, I'd add a couple of things that, if Australia does get to host it, I think there's two particular ways. So one, that communities can influence the politicians who will be kind of, part of the government that is hosting or co-hosting that event, but also directly. I was lucky enough to be at the Glasgow COP, so in 2021, I'm going to say, and one of the things that was really interesting and quite different to some others that I'd been to, where they were in, I went to one in Qatar, for instance, and where there isn't that civil society, there isn't that kind of real strong community interest in climate issues. And in Glasgow, people were, on the street, outside the venue, day after day. And, the negotiators and the industry had to come through that. And so there was that sense that people really cared and really saw it as an immediate issue that affected their lives. That's, so one, definitely, tell government what we think we want, but also tell the people directly, go out, there's lots of creative, peaceful ways to protest. And it may not feel like it, but I can tell you that inside the rooms where those discussions were happening, they felt obliged to comment on the degree of feeling in the streets. It does matter.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got quite a few questions to get through. I would love to talk about how an Australian COP could demonstrate some leadership to the region, but we'll move on. We've got three questions that are sort of related, but I'll start with the first one, which comes from Christopher from the USA. And the question is just around how politics versus science affect climate action in 2025. Obviously, Climateworks is a climate policy institute at its core, and we really do focus on that political and policy layer as it relates to corporates and as it relates to governments. But I'm interested, perhaps I could pass to you first, Anna, in sort of how you think the link between the science and the politics affects the work we do and affects the work that the broader climate movement does in Australia.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a scientist by training, so it sits underneath everything that I think about. And really, it is that piece about, you have to understand the strengths of science, that it kind of looks for answers, it sort of creates evidence, it explores things kind of calmly and rationally. But in the end, we're talking about decisions made by people and, sort of behavior by people that affects all the decisions. Now, so you've got to get that right blend of a really decent evidence base that Climateworks definitely seeks to develop, as do others, but also understand people as people and the fact that, straight evidence, it does not result in perfect decisions. We all wish it did. So you also have to understand, what do people want and what are people afraid of? And whether that's the community, industry, businesses, or the politicians. And really, so do that mix of kind of behavioral science, it's still science, but understanding that, you need both sides. You need science and you need kind of heart and feelings and connecting with people.
Yeah, absolutely. Chang, we've got a sort of a related question, so I might give you an opportunity to respond to both this question of politics versus science in climate action, but also this second question, which is from Chloe in Melbourne, about how the drastic changes happening under the new US administration might impact the APAC region's goals. I know we've talked a lot internally about the sort of the obvious kind of implications on China's leadership in marine supply chains and the opportunities for Australia. But yeah, just interested, Chung, if you have thoughts on one or both of those topics.
Sure, thanks, Luke. So I think I really agree with Anna in terms of it needs both. I think science stay long-term and politicians comes and go. Some stay long, but then I think science is something that link us through together, and we need to do both, like long-term and short-term. I think also the science, with the global issue like climate change, the science and the politics needs to go beyond one country. It needs a shared understanding of scientific evidence across the globe, and also it needs politicians across different countries come together to agree on the scientific views as well. So that's quite a big opportunity and challenge. I think let's come to the question in terms of the US politics. I think it's, and that's an example of how the global issues cannot be solved by one single country. I think the impact of the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, and also some of the biggest financing for the South Asia region, for example, the Just Energy Transition Partnership, it will certainly has a very big impact in terms of raising the ambitions on for the region for 1.5 Li, and also in terms of the financing, which is so much needed for the region. As I mentioned, it's the region, it include countries having GDP per capita less than $5,000 per year. So the lack of climate financing and development financing will certainly very impact upon the region. And I think you're right, Luke. I think there's a very potential for other countries to show strong leadership and collaboration. The good news is that ASEAN actually quite having a quite strong partnership. I think it has around 17 strategic dialogue partnerships with countries from China, EU, America, UK, and altogether they account for, I think, around 80% of the global GDP. So I think having that diversification of partnership, I think it's a good, a big advantage for South Asia. And I think China also China can play a very important role, and then within South Asia, Singapore can play a very important role to facilitate a lot of important initiatives in the region. And let's not forget Japan and Korea, who are very big traditional financiers to infrastructure financing in the region. So I think it's important for these players coming together and scale up sustainable infrastructure in the region.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chung. As usual, we have some really fantastic questions and not enough time. I might pitch to our organizers that we do a rest of politics style questions only briefing room one day. But I've got a sort of a perfect one for you, Chung, and a perfect one for you, Anna. But just before I do that, there's a really important question that I'd love to just touch on myself very briefly using my chair's prerogative. And it's from Ida in Indonesia, and it talks about the ethics and the environmental costs of nickel and biofuel development in Indonesia. I think this is a really, really important question. We've seen in areas such as Morowali in Sulawesi in Indonesia, just a really rapid expansion of coal-fired processing of nickel, but also some really, truly horrible human and environmental impacts. I don't propose to have an immediate solution to all of those problems, but I think it's a really important body of work that we're very much incorporating into our industrial precinct work, partly in terms of the renewables which I think is critical in the sense of phasing out coal power plants on Java while rapidly adding coal capacity in Morowali is not going to lead to a net zero goal as the government's ambition states. But also, as you identified, that really environmental and human aspect. I think there's a lot of issues to unpack here, which would be really useful to do in a separate briefing room, but particularly around how do we price internationally? How do we send a signal to the market that those sorts of supply chain issues matter? When people are buying a car, they need to be sure that the battery has come from a region that hasn't caused widespread human and environmental damage. So yeah, just a really important question that I didn't want to leave unanswered. I will pass back to our panelists though. There's a really great question here, a series of questions here for you, Anna, just with the time we have available, about how can we better utilize consumer energy resources and reduce the use of coal. So this is, PV, batteries, EVs, instead of curtailing residential and commercial scale renewables. This is from Adam, who joins us from the APS. And there's a related question which I'll tack on, which is just how does that utilization fit with the broader challenges around grid stability and the current state of transmission and electricity infrastructure, particularly on the East Coast. So just with maybe a minute or two before we wrap, if you have a thought on that. Thank you, Anna.
I do, of course, have lots of thoughts on that, but we do spend a lot of time as Climateworks thinking about that kind of demand side of the electricity system. So yes, we need more renewable energy supply, but we also need to think about how do customers use their energy, how, what customers can have their own generation, whether that's, solar panels on roofs. And that's not just our homes, that's also, one of the things most people notice I've got a British accent. One of the things I noticed when I moved the latest time to Australia was how far ahead even the UK was in terms of, getting solar panels on commercial and industrial sites. So there's a whole world of opportunities. Now, the problem is, though, that currently our grid is designed to get power from a few big places and deliver it to us, the customer. So you do need a fair bit of investment in those distribution systems and in the market itself so that we can make the best use of customer energy, and not just the energy they produce, but also giving them signals about when they should be using energy. So there's this idea of load following, renewables tends to be more variable. So you need to get load following that variability rather than, wanting the same demand all the time. We've got lots of ideas about how that can fit into current conversations that's happening in Australia, and how to help, particularly big industrial companies make the most out of energy demand and start to, so that they can support the grid, make it more reliable, more stable. And that then, unlocks smaller scale customers to be able to put, solar into the grid when it's being created.
If you want a
many
magic
other
trick,
ideas.
Thank you, Anna. That's fantastic. And if our listeners need a magic trick for how to make a cup of tea go cold, ask Anna a question on this issue in the Climateworks tea room, and you'll be brought into a fascinating conversation. And the time will slip away. The time has slipped away on us here for our first briefing room of the year. I just want to leave with a very quick final observation from each of our panelists around a really great question from Sam in Canberra. And the question is really simple. What gives you hope about the future? So Chung, what gives you hope about the future of climate action?
Yeah, thanks, Luke. That's such a great question. We need a lot of hope these days. I think what I really like to think about is that looking back in the last 10 years, technologies, knowledge, policies have evolved significantly. And so I think we have almost all the tools we need to get to net zero. The answer is there. It's just a matter of how fast we can get there. So I think it requires a really strong partnership and collaboration to build that confidence. And I think the fact that we have 500 people register for the webinar today, I think it's a really great way to foster this partnership. And I really look forward to learning from everyone joining on the call and fostering this knowledge exchange, and also build that confidence for accelerating the actions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tung and Anna.
Yeah, I'd say pretty much it's about the people. You know, we know most of the solutions, and we've got some very smart people on our side, and I get to work with many of them every day. And that's what gives me hope, is definitely people. And also, just a little analogy, you know, water does always find its way downhill. Sometimes it has to go the long way round. I think the road to net zero is downhill in a good way. And, you know, I think we will get there. I just think, you know, there is no question there will be barriers on the way. There's many vested interests, but the right people, smart people. And as Trung said, we've got the technologies, we've got the solutions. It's now about putting them in play.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point to leave it on. I think what gives me hope is that sense, as you've both said, that, you know, this debate, this conversation has shifted to smart people discussing how, instead of questions of sort of why or even if. And it's really encouraging to see the amount of engagement that we get in our work throughout the portfolio, but also including from all of you on the call today. So thank you so much for joining us. That brings us to the end of our discussion. I want to say a special thanks to our speakers, Anna Malos and Chung Nguyen, and an extra special thanks to the team behind the scenes, Simon Brown, Alison Corton, Tahara Horngren, and Sophie Stefanakis. You can find out more about all of our work, catch up on this and previous briefing rooms at climateworkscentre.org. We will make sure to send a recording through, as well as links to all the resources we discussed. So please do keep an eye on your inbox, and please do let us know if you have ideas or requests for future briefing room events. And we hope you can join us for a briefing room event sometime soon. Thank you so much, and all the very best.